Well, hello and welcome to another episode of In Conversation with Benedict Rogers, an interview series produced by Hong Kong Watch. And it's a really great pleasure to be joined for this episode by Alistair Carmichael. Alistair is the Member of Parliament for the northernmost constituency in the United Kingdom, Orkney and Shetland, and has served in Parliament for 22 years, since 2001. I think the longest serving Liberal Democrat in Parliament today. And Alistair is currently the Liberal Democrats' spokesperson on Home Affairs, Justice and Northern Ireland. He served previously in the coalition government's cabinet as firstly the Liberal Democrats' chief whip and then Secretary of State for Scotland. And he chairs the all-party parliamentary group on Hong Kong, and also the APPG on the Uyghurs, and is a patron of Hong Kong Watch and a real friend to Hong Kongers. So, Alistair Carmichael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Ben. It's a pleasure to be in discussion. Hi.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, can I start by asking, first of all, how and why you got involved with Hong Kong specifically?
Well, Hong Kong is interesting. I think it was essentially down to the late Paddy Ashdown, who is, because I know you worked with him a lot yourself, Ben, was an absolute stalwart, the champion of Hong Kongers and their campaign for fair treatment. And, looking back on what Paddy did, especially through the 1990s, when, shall we say, it wasn't quite such a fashionable cause. You have to think that if the government had done then what Paddy Ashdown was wanting them to do, then we wouldn't be where we are today, because always, when you're dealing with China and any of the big superpowers, the signals that you send matter. And I think the signals that we would have sent by giving Hong Kongers the rights that we've subsequently and very belatedly given them for resettlement would have been a different signal to send to the Chinese, and we would have been saying, we're taking this joint declaration seriously, we're sticking with it, and we're sticking with the people of Hong Kong. So, it was essentially Paddy who got me in the first place. But there's an element of my own personality in all this as well. And it's once I know about something that I think is wrong, that I'm not happy about, then I don't find it easy just to walk away from it. So, I was one of the first, I suppose, as the joint declaration started to unravel, who could see what was happening in Hong Kong, and it sat ill with me as somebody who believes in human rights and the rule of law. I just felt, this is part of Britain's history. We can't just walk away from it. And inch by inch, you get pulled into it. I don't regret it for a second. I've met some wonderful people, and I think that I keep saying this, the defining characteristic of human rights is their universality. And we don't really value human rights anywhere unless we value them everywhere.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And of course, the late Paddy Ashdown was one of Hong Kong Watch's founding patrons, and we were delighted. We were extremely sad to lose him, but we were delighted that you took on that role with us after his
well, he was an absolute force of nature. You mentioned in your introduction there that I was a Liberal Democrat chief whip. One of the jobs that I used to get as chief whip, although he was never an MP when I was an MP, was being the Paddy Ashdown wrangler. And when Paddy wasn't happy about something, I would be sent off to try and talk him round, and there were always interesting conversations, shall we say. But you look at what he achieved in politics and in all the other roles that he took in life, in diplomacy, in the army, and youth work, an enormous loss.
Absolutely. I mean, I will never forget when I was denied entry to Hong Kong in October 2017, just before we launched Hong Kong Watch. The very day it got out on the news, and the very day I arrived back in London, Paddy called me and said, "Come and see me." And I went to see him a couple of days later, and he said, "Since you can't go to Hong Kong, why don't I go instead?" And we arranged it for him. We found the funding for it, and a couple of weeks later, he was in Hong Kong. So no,
That's
really.
the man. Yeah, and I've had a few of these summonses over the years. They're not easy to decline, but they were always very productive. Yeah.
Exactly. Tell me, you, as I mentioned in the introduction, you represent Orkney and Shetland, which is well, the northernmost constituency in the UK, but also quite a far cry from Hong Kong. What do your constituents make of your very active role on championing international human rights?
I think they have learned over the years that some, human rights and Britain's position in the world stage, and the rule of law are things that matter to me. I wouldn't honestly say that this is an issue that is going to reap thousands of votes for me at the next election or any other. But as long as I'm here doing the important work that constituents need me to do, I'm up to my eyes at the moment dealing with the consequences of a Home Office decision in relation to visas for fishing crews, for example, which is something that really does matter to people here. And these things are always my first priority. And as long as they are that first priority, then I think they're quite happy for me to do the other things that also matter to me, which don't have the same immediate local impact. We have a very small Chinese community in the Northern Isles, and some of them do have Hong Kong connections. And in sort of taking a more robust approach to our relations with the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, I've always been very clear that we must not allow that to be something which has an adverse impact on the Chinese communities across the United Kingdom, who make a tremendous contribution to an awful lot of our communities. And, we hear some of the things that go on around police stations and the rest of it, which need to be tackled and called out. But remember that so many of people who live here now from China, for one reason or another, would find it difficult ever to go back there. And engagement with the Chinese community and with the Hong Kong community in particular, I think it's very important, because I fought very hard and ultimately successfully, along with others, to get the right of residence attached to the BNO passport. But I think it's essential that we understand that when people get off the plane at Heathrow, that's not the end of the story. That's actually just the beginning of the story. And, the people who are coming here from Hong Kong are coming from a very traumatizing situation. The Northern Isles is my home, and the idea that I would not be able to live here and have to go and live somewhere else on the other side of the world, I would find enormously traumatizing. So, I think our duty to Hong Kongers is that, having stood with them and offered them the opportunity to join us here and make a new life if that's what they want to do, then that obligation continues, and we have to continue to stand by them and support them, understanding that the adjustment isn't always going to be easy, and that there will in particular be language problems for some people, professional qualifications possibly for others, and of course there is always the danger of there being mental health issues arising as a consequence of the trauma that has brought them here.
That's absolutely right. And you've actually anticipated and largely answered a question I was going to ask anyway, which is, basically the government has, I think, done really the right thing and deserves credit for introducing the BNO scheme and then for extending the BNO scheme, thanks to the efforts of people like yourself and Lord Alton, Lord Patron in the House of Lords. But are there specific things that you think the government should be doing now that it isn't, to help with integration and welcome? You touched on some of the issues. I think mental health is definitely one. Yeah. But do you have specific recommendations for the government?
Well, I had a fascinating session at LSE a few weeks ago with the Hong Kong Students Association there. I think Public Affairs Society, they call themselves. And for me, that was a really interesting session, because it wasn't for once just me as a member of Parliament going along and lecturing people. I was able to do quite a lot of listening as well. And I think probably the most important issue that we're going to have to deal with, because it's the classic case of the stitch in time that saves 9, is around the mental health issues that come from the trauma that many people have experienced in order to come here, the ambivalence that they feel about getting involved, because of course they have family back at home who are still subject to the national security law. We know the scope of that, the difficulty if you are seen to have been colluding with people like myself, for example. So we do need. I think the big takeaway for me for that was the need for better mental health provision that would be specifically tailored. But going beyond that, I'm hesitating here a little bit, Ben, because when we talk about it in these terms, when we frame the debate in this way, we risk talking about the problems of Hong Kongers in the United Kingdom, and we don't see the myriad opportunities that come. I think in relation to just being seen to have done the right thing, at its most basic level, but also so many of these people are bringing real talents and enriching the communities that they are then part of. That it's I don't want Hong Kongers in Britain to be seen as a problem, when in fact they are an enormously enriching and welcoming presence in our community. I think there's a particular issue in some of our universities where it's pretty clear that there is a concerted and highly orchestrated effort from the People's Republic of China to silence Hong Kong voices and any dissident Chinese voices within universities. Where we see that, we have to be willing to call it out and to act on it, to stop it. I think that's a duty of care that all our universities have, and I would like to see them take it much more seriously. We all in politics are familiar with the maxim that he who pays the piper calls the tune. And we know that UK universities are enormously reliant on Chinese funding and Chinese partnerships in so many different areas, not least the number of Chinese undergraduates that come here. And again, these should be good opportunities for us. We've got a long history in higher education in this country of building soft power, but it's not working in the same way with Chinese. So I think after mental health, the protection of students in particular in the higher education community would be the areas that I think are most pressing and most clamant.
Well, I absolutely agree with all of that. Just shifting our focus to Hong Kong itself. Before you went into politics, you were a lawyer. If I have read your bio,
still in recovery. Yes.
Well, as a recovering lawyer, what's your assessment of the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary in Hong Kong today?
Well, I mean, if you look to take as a working example to illustrate the difficulties here, the case of Jimmy Lai, the proprietor of Apple Daily, who's currently in prison in Hong Kong. It really does show how far and how quickly things have deteriorated. Now, we first got a sense of this in the APPG in Hong Kong, that's the all-party group. We did a report on the treatment of humanitarian workers in relation to the policing of the protests in Hong Kong. And it was apparent to me at that stage, and this goes back to a report we did in 2020 on events that had happened years earlier. And the Hong Kong police force, which had been an organisation that had long-standing connections to policing organisations in the United Kingdom, and which had very much conducted itself on the same basis of policing by consent that we're familiar with in this country, that was shot by this time. The Hong Kong police force had completely changed. It was no longer the sort of independent arbiter of good order and law in the community. And I think one of the positives has been the refusal of serving UK judges to sit in Hong Kong courts. I think that was long overdue, and I think Lord Reid, as Lord President of the Supreme Court, he deserves a lot of credit for that. Judges are never comfortable, for reasons that we all understand, in straying into areas that are essentially political, but that was a necessary thing for the integrity of our own judicial system, quite apart from anything else, for them to do. It does concern me that there continues to be retired judges sitting in Hong Kong, and that some of the large the city firms, as well as the financial institutions, still keep trying to pretend that it's business as usual. Now, if it's not already started, we're shortly to be given a charm offences from the Hong Kong administration coming here telling us that it's business as usual. So I think, being able to point to cases like Jimmy Lai, who incidentally, let me remind you, is a British citizen, he holds a British passport, and who is, completely without any proper treatment that we would accept as being in accordance with the principles of natural law. And, I think it also illustrates well the way in which the wall that you have between national security law on one side and common law on the other is now completely porous. So, the justification for British lawyers continuing to work in the criminal justice system or the judicial system as a whole is bogus. And the common law system is not providing any protection for people against the national security law, and in fact one is being used to build a case against the other, as it is in Jimmy Lai's case, then to be used in the other. So the situation for the rule of law in Hong Kong, I think is powerless, and I think legal firms, retired judges, the financial institutions, the banks are going to have to take a long, hard look at themselves, because Jimmy Lai was a businessman. He operated a big operation in Hong Kong, but that was no protection for him. And, if you think that you can turn a blind eye to what's going on politically in terms of human rights, then come the day when something happens that will matter to your bank or your firm, then there will be no protection left for you. So ultimately, these guys are, I think, just being, they're doing themselves no favors in the long run, even if it might help their profit and loss account this year or next year.
Absolutely right. There's several things in there that I'd like to just build on briefly. You've touched on the upcoming charm offensive. I believe on Sunday, the Secretary for Financial Services from Hong Kong, Christopher Hui, arrived in London for a 3-day ministerial visit. It's the first time a Hong Kong minister has come in the last 3 years. So the first time since the national security law, since the blatant violation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Do you think that, given that the Chinese government and by extension its government in Hong Kong has violated this international treaty, is this visit to the UK appropriate? What do you think the UK government's position should be? And particularly, I'd be interested to hear your views on sanctions, because we have not sanctioned anyone in the Hong Kong or Chinese government over the Hong Kong issue. The US has. But on Sunday, we're going to welcome a Hong Kong government minister.
Yes, I might be wrong with this, Ben, you'll correct me if I am, but I think he himself has been sanctioned by the United States.
I think so. Yeah.
I think that might be, but regardless of whether that's correct or not, it comes back to what I said earlier about the signals that we're sending. And, I have a lot of admiration for the diplomatic service that we have in this country, and the Foreign Office. So I don't want to diss their efforts, but it is, I think, essentially always the case that they can be something of a victim of groupthink, and they can always be slow to change. I can remember some of the conversations I had with diplomats in the run-up to the war in Iraq in 2003, when they were very dismissive, for example, of the French position at that stage, and they were completely unquestioning in their acceptance of the need for a military action. You won't find many of them admit it these days, because, of course, we see the war in Iraq very differently now, and the legality of the basis of it is pretty much, or the lack of legality in the basis of it is pretty much accepted. And I fear that the same thing risks happening in relation to our relations with China. And it's not at a ministerial level. It's maybe not even at the sort of top levels of the Foreign Office, but within the British civil service, there is still a view that persists that we have to we have to trim our message in relation to China, and that could you just wind your neck in a bit here, tone down the rhetoric about human rights, and we've got a delegation coming up, or we've got a deal that we want to sign, or a conference that we're all going to be part of. And I think that thinking still very much prevails within the civil service in this country, and it does require constant hammering from people like myself, David Dalton, Ian Duncan Smith, Catherine West. It's a view that runs across rather than between the political parties. And you know, look, I did my best to get some scrutiny of that visit before Parliament went into recess for Easter. Ultimately, we weren't able to get it onto the floor of the House. But I just think we're sending all the wrong signals, and we know that China reads signals very carefully, more carefully possibly than they will read the sort of text of the formal position. And I think that welcoming people like that and muting the criticism is entirely the wrong signal to be sending.
Absolutely. One of the specific issues that we in Hong Kong Watch are trying to highlight in a particular way around Christopher Hui's visit is the issue of the Hong Kong government essentially prohibiting Hong Kongers who are coming here as BNOs from withdrawing their MPF pension scheme. And, you know, these are people who've, it's their hard-earned savings. And essentially the Hong Kong government has frozen them or even stolen them. They're denying them access to their pensions. And Christopher Hui, as Secretary for Financial Services, is ultimately the man responsible. What do you think the British government, but also the city, the banks that are involved in this, should be doing?
Well, look, for the banks, it should be the canary in the coal mine, because frankly, if that can happen to the assets of Hong Kongers who have come here, then it can happen to them and the assets that they have, the investments that they have in Hong Kong at some future date. And, you know, I think I see nothing that makes me think it won't. And, you know, from the point of view of our own country, I would love to think that that would be item number one on any agenda that you have in discussions with people like that. But unfortunately, experience tells me that it'll be lucky to make it into any other business.
Well, we're almost coming to the end of our conversation. I have a penultimate question, and then I'll end with the last question. My penultimate question: tell us a bit more about the APPG, why it was established, what it does, what impact it has, and related to that, I know that you have a current inquiry on media freedom, specifically Jimmy Lai and Apple Daily. Without revealing anything that you don't want to reveal before the report is published, maybe you could just give us a flavour of the importance of that inquiry.
Okay, well, the APPG is one of many all-party parliamentary groups, and you know, I'm enormously fortunate as co-chair with Natalie Bennett, the Green member of the House of Lords, Lord Dalton in the House of Lords as a crossbencher, and a number of other colleagues in both houses, that we have good engagement. And you know, it is one of the more active and I think effective all-party groups that we have. We set it up just before we were probably the shortest lived APPG of the 17 to 19 Parliament, because we'd really just got ourselves enrolled and the general election was called. And we're, you know, since we came back after that election, we've been going good style. We've produced a number of reports. I think acting as a forum for people of all political parties to come together with a particular focus on Hong Kong is important. And it's also acted as a point of contact in Parliament for groups like Hong Kong Watch, Stand with Hong Kong, Campaign for Hong Kong Freedom. And you know, from that point of view, it's been effective. Looking ahead, I'm keen that, you know, there are other similar groups and legislators across Europe and in America, and we shouldn't just all sit in our own little corner reinventing the wheel. and that we should be sharing experience. Quite apart from anything else, as a liberal and as an internationalist, I think that if we're going to change the terms of trade with China, then we have to do that on a multilateral basis. There is no individual country, not even the United States of America, that's big enough to do this on their own. So we need to get countries working together, and I think a helpful addition to getting governments working together would be to get parliamentarians working together. We are currently working on the report into press freedom. I think that will be coming out in the next week or so. If anybody's interested, there will be on YouTube or other social media platforms recordings of the session we had recently with the legal team for Jimmy Lai. And when I say the legal team, I should actually correct that. It's the international legal team, because, and this just illustrates perfectly the nature of the national security law. Jimmy Lai can't have a single legal team, so he's got his legal team who are instructed in Hong Kong, but they have to be kept completely discreet from his legal team that is working outside Hong Kong on his interests, because anything else would leave them subject to the provisions of the national security law. I think we will be the report, when you see it, I think will be one which I fear will make quite depressing reading for anybody who's been involved with Hong Kong over the years. Natalie Bennett, my co-chair, actually was a journalist in Hong Kong, and it will, I fear, be an illustration of just how bad things have got, and that effectively now, in the way that we understand it in the West, there is no free press left in Hong Kong. And that's why that's one of the things that really I think we were trying to protect with the joint declaration, and why it's a tragedy for human rights and it's a tragedy for the rule of law and freedom of expression that the Chinese government have been able to trash that declaration with apparent impunity.
Absolutely. Just very finally, we're almost out of time, but in a few words, do you have a final message for people who are watching this, particularly for Hong Kongers themselves?
Yes, I do. And it is essentially that, look, just don't despair. Things are always darkest before the dawn. And, you mentioned, Ben, that I've been in Parliament for almost 22 years now. I actually have been a political activist since I was 14. I joined the then Liberal Party in 1980. And, through the 1980s, there were big campaigns, strategic politics that really dominated the formative years of my political education. One of them was in relation to the Cold War with the former Soviet Union. The other was in relation to apartheid in South Africa. And on both these issues, it felt sometimes like you were just howling into the wind. But we kept going on anyway. We made the determined effort. And in both cases, the Berlin Wall coming down, Nelson Mandela walking out of the Victor Verster prison, change just suddenly came when we least expected it, and at a pace that was almost chaotic, was chaotic in many ways. I think that while don't ask me when or how or what the mechanism so it's going to be, but I think the same will happen with Hong Kong the Uyghur population, China, as ever. You know, human rights are never easy, but ultimately, it's they always win out in the end.
Mm. Absolutely. Well, that's a really important and positive note on which to end. So, Alistair Carmichael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Ben, thank you. I've enjoyed the chat.
Thank you.